Gene Roddenberry returns to Paramount. This is episode 27.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casto, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
Sit back with me now, if you will, and remember what it was like in 1975, before Star Trek was resurrected. Because this week, we're talking about Gene Roddenberry returning to Paramount. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casto. Gene's return marked the first real step by Paramount to get the live-action version of Star Trek made again. But it wouldn't go smoothly.
Of course not. I mean, it's Star Trek, right? Nothing ever went smoothly. Before we have that discussion, though, let me tell the listeners how to find us. You can reach us at our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/70s Trek. And you're welcome to leave us a question or a comment.
You can also find our little show on iTunes. If you leave us a rating or a review, it'll help other Trek fans find the show.
You know, Gene's return to Paramount was the result of a lot of things that were happening in the early 70s. A lot of things. A lot. Chief among them, though, was syndication. The show was on every day, usually around 6 p.m. when young people were looking for something other than the evening news to watch. So they found Star Trek. And we talked about this in an earlier episode, Cal. It was that everyday factor.
It was.
You know, another thing that happened that was big for Star Trek was NASA. You know, the success of the Apollo program. Geez, if you were a naysayer about the possibility of exploring space in 1968, well, by 1970, you're not anymore. Star Trek, NASA sort of showed that Star Trek was obtainable.
Right.
And I think people really started to get excited, you know, with NASA's success, the Apollo program's success, and syndication. And then we see, boom, the conventions in 1972 beginning with, 3,000, 5,000 people. By the time you get to the mid-70s, we've got conventions that drew 10,000, 15,000 people. I think NBC and Paramount began to look at that and think, wow, there really is an audience here. This enthusiasm is growing. So,
yeah, I don't think they knew how to handle it even.
No, right. I mean, and you have to remember, too, this is kind of virgin territory. This had never happened to a canceled show before. So, what do? They say, hey, let's try something different with this property and let's try the animated series, which I also think sort of contributed to this growing snowball that was Star Trek in the early 70s. It just introduced Trek to a whole younger audience, kind of fueling the fire. Okay, so I used two metaphors there. I just want to point this out. The rolling snowball metaphor, and then also the fuel on the fire metaphor.
Yes, which will melt the snowball.
Yes, I'm mixing both fire and ice together. I think Pat Benatar had a song called Fire. Anyway,
yes, but that's later.
Yes, that's much later. The other thing that I think really helped in the early 70s were the James Blish books. They were like always there in the background, and it gave fans sort of a touchstone, if you will, something to hold on to and something to look forward to as the new books came out. And again, it's just fueling that excitement, that yearning to see something new, don't you think?
Absolutely.
And then you got models and toys. There were a lot of toys in the 70s. And the AMT model kits, if you were a fan, how cool is that stuff?
Oh, yeah.
But as we said at the top of this little diatribe, it was syndication. And by 1975, that little canceled show that nobody really understood how to get their money back from it, it cost a lot. Suddenly, that show is making Paramount millions of dollars.
Millions.
Yeah. So, like, all of these things over the 6 years from the time Star Trek was canceled, all of these things contributed to the popularity, and this cry out in the public was just getting louder and louder. And I just want to, for our younger listeners, I just want to point one thing out, too. This was in a rather primitive era of no internet, no social media. We didn't even have those idiot bulletin boards that you had in the 90s.
No, no even email or anything like that.
No text, no email. We were very isolated. We were isolated little markets, little TV markets.
A handful of TV channels.
And yet, somehow, across the country, this idea of bringing back Star Trek, it spreads like wildfire without all of the new technology pushing it like we have today. Right. Why then? So anyway, with all of the stuff that I just talked about, with all of this cry to bring Star Trek back, why did it take so long?
David Alexander wrote in his biography of Gene, Star Trek creator, he said, and I quote, "The return of Star Trek was a long, convoluted journey. Nothing like the Star Trek phenomenon had ever happened before. It was uncharted territory for everyone, including studio execs. They had seen fads before and had not recognized that Star Trek was becoming a phenomenon, part of American culture. It was not a fad. But there was always some fear lurking in the minds of some of the executives that the fad, quote unquote, would peak and any monies invested would be lost."
Well, that makes sense. Sorry, that makes a lot of sense, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely does. He continues with, "Everyone wanted to be protected. No one wanted to risk a job or a career on a wrong decision."
Jeez, can you imagine that makes total sense, what Alexander wrote here. There had to be a ton of apprehension. So there's some, groupies, basically, is what they're comparing them to. Watching this nerdy show, they dress up in these weird costumes and have pointy ears. Is this really worth investing millions on?
Right. And is it going to be here next year? Or are they going to move on to something else?
Right. I get it.
Oh, I do too. So, quote continues, "And the studio was reluctant for another purely financial reason. Alexander states that a new series would mean negotiation with actors who were now far more valuable than they were a few years before."
Oh, of course.
Of course. And Paramount was rightfully hesitant to pour money into something that might not show a return for years.
Jeez. Makes a lot of sense, actually.
Oh, it sure does. And, you got inflation, you got, their worth as actors. Who knows how much it would have cost?
The sets probably cost more. The special effects cost more. And then you're right. Then these actors who are now on a property that people want to see can demand more money.
Exactly. There was also fear in the mid-'70s that a new Star Trek show would diminish the value of what they called Paramount's 79 jewels, the original episodes, which, right at that time were bringing in millions.
Oh, my God. So they were afraid of producing new Trek because it might take away from old Trek that was making the money.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
Crazy.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting because, I looked at some things and talk about bringing the show back. It occurred almost as soon as the show went off the air. There were talks, and I think we noted this in an earlier 70s Trek episode. There were talks between Gene and NBC in late 69, early 70 about, hey, do you think we could do this again? Suddenly the ratings look kind of good for it.
Yeah.
But they had destroyed the sets, and it was going to be a large investment. And then there were talks after that. If you and I talked about this, and I remember correctly, that NBC came back and said, we're kind of interested, but we'd like you to do a pilot.
Right.
And Roddenberry said, I did 79 episodes. Is that okay?
And there was 2 pilots involved in that.
Yeah, right. I did 79 episodes. Could we call that the pilot and maybe move on? So as the early 70s are moving forward, there are these talks on again, off again. And Roddenberry was interviewed in 73 for Show Magazine, and he said, and I quote, "The people at NBC have come to the point of being ready to put up the money for a new pilot, a 2-hour film, but the brass at Paramount are reluctant to take the risk. They say that if they produce new shows, the old ones won't be worth the high rental fees that they get from stations, that they're charging, and the demand will drop off." So we were stalemated again. So there's Gene Roddenberry kind of talking about your earlier point that they don't want to diminish Paramount's 79 jewels. Fascinating. Right. So, it's this tug of war over money. Well, we got something that's making a lot of money. Yeah, but we got something that might make more money. Yeah, but this is kind of good. It's making a lot of money now. Yeah, but this might make a lot more money. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, I think, though, that, your snowball, as you mentioned before, you can kind of see it in some of the communication that was going on at the time.
Yeah.
So in 74, Gene wrote a letter to a fan, and he was saying the status of the Star Trek theatrical film has gone from fair to good, perhaps very good.
Ooh.
Yeah, exciting. Ooh, I got excited right there.
Yeah.
Negotiations are currently underway.
And that was in 74?
74.
Okay.
Yeah, so then in 75, February 75, Gene, he tapes an episode to Tell the Truth with Gary Moore.
Oh, God, do you remember that show?
Oh, gosh. It was funny there. Regardless. So this episode, though, it began airing around the country in April. So that it's building excitement, right? Gene's getting out there.
That's awesome. I've seen that. It's on YouTube, by the way, kids. If you want to go search for it, just search Gene Roddenberry to Tell the Truth, and you can watch that episode. I couldn't believe I found it one day just looking around for things.
Yeah, I have to go watch it again. In March, then, of 75, the next month, Gene's writing to a friend, and he says, "As for the motion picture, it appears we have now completed an arrangement with Paramount. And from all signs, it also seems that they want it to be a major picture with ample budget and plenty of quote-unquote name stars in guest and cameo roles." And it turns out Paramount actually approved a Star Trek feature film with a budget of $5 million.
Wow. $5 million?
$5 million.
Okay, so think about that for a second, because an episode in 69 was running, $186,000? And now you've got this budget for $5 million? My goodness, that's quite an increase. But again, it was going to be a film.
Right.
And then compare that, though, this is what will blow most people's minds. Compare that to the cost of the motion picture, which was somewhere between $43 and $50 million. And
just a few years later.
Just a few years later. And that was the most expensive movie ever made to that point in time. That's crazy.
That is
crazy. So Paramount and Gene reach this agreement and have this new development deal. It's going to be a feature. Oh my God, everyone's excited that is involved in Star Trek, and they begin to talk to the cast and try to get them signed aboard. All they really need is a story. So here it is, May 1975, and think of this timing too. It's just 7 months after the end of the original run of the animated series. The events aren't that far away from each other.
No, not at all.
Gene drives onto the lot of Paramount, and he goes to an office of a guy who is in charge of assigning offices. And he's allowed to pick his offices. And he picks the exact offices that he was in when he produced Star Trek. Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
So there he is in the exact offices in 1975 working on new Star Trek. But they're the same.
Like he never left.
Right. It's like he never left. That's right. So he begins working on this idea. He has this idea and he calls it the God thing. And it has, at this time in May 75, it has a production start date of July 15th, 1976. So he's got a year and 2 months to work on the script, to get all the pre-production details in order. And again, like you said, there's a budget set. It's at $5 million. Interestingly, there was a little blurb that I came across that ran in the Chicago Tribune the same month, May 75. And it was an answer to a question that somebody had about, hey, will there ever be new Star Trek episodes? And someone for the Chicago Tribune wrote the following: you may catch the crew of the Enterprise at your local movie house later this year. Paramount hopes to make a feature film with the original cast and add a sprinkling of major Hollywood names and cameo roles. So that hits the papers. Obviously, there was a press release that had gone out, and it backs up everything that you had said just a few seconds ago. Right. This was real. It was happening. It wasn't, come into the office and maybe work on it. We'll see what we come up with. It was real. It was moving forward. Wow. So in June 75, Gene is writing a family member, and he says the following about this new development project. The Star Trek motion picture script goes as well as can be expected during the pulling and tugging of first draft. Meanwhile, I have suspended all traveling and lectures and probably won't get out around much until sometime this winter. A motion picture is really the same size chore as doing a novel, and it must be done in much less time. I kind of look at that and I read that he's feeling the heat in June.
Yes.
It's getting a little tough.
Yeah. How am I going to hit 1976?
Yeah, right.
In that short a time. That's
so you actually kind of looked and found out what the script was about a little bit.
Yeah. So the God thing you mentioned is the title, and it was basically Captain Kirk meets God.
Oh my gosh.
The author, John Engel, described it this way. His proposed story told of a flying saucer hovering above Earth that was programmed to send down people who looked like prophets, including Jesus Christ. Who or what programmed the craft was not addressed. So John Poville, Gene's assistant, commented, basically, God was a malfunctioning spaceship.
What? Wait a minute. Okay, so he came up with this idea that for Christians and all the things that Christians hold true, and maybe other religions too, for all we know, that they're the result of a malfunctioning spaceship.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Crazy. So, and no surprise, in August 1975, Paramount CEO Barry Diller rejects Roddenberry's treatment of the God thing.
Yeah, you think?
I wonder why.
Jeez.
The fact that the script questioned the nature and existence of God, I guess, was just a little too much.
It might have had a small role in the decision. Maybe just a small role.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Then Gene, maybe not taking responsibility for potentially a bad script or bad concept or whatever. He blames the religious background of Paramount execs, including Barry Diller. Barry was a practicing Catholic, so he probably had some say in not doing that.
Oh my gosh. So, that's really interesting too, because here he is, he's creating the script called The God Thing, and basically he's looking into it and saying, these beliefs that we have about God, well, they can really be explained by extraterrestrial intervention. And it's not the first time that Gene Roddenberry has gone to the well and tried to explain the existence of God, is it?
No, and it wouldn't be the last either.
No, and it wouldn't be the last. I mean, just in the original series alone, I was thinking about this, and I came up with, where no man has gone before. You've got the guy who turns into a god. The Return of the Archons, where a computer was basically playing the role of a god who mourns for Adonais. Our Greek gods were really just aliens. The Changeling, Nomad is looking for the creator. In a sense, you could say his god, which is man.
Yeah.
We know that.
Or Kirk.
Right. Yeah, Jackson Roy Kirk. And then there's the Apple, where we have another computer playing the role of a god, Vol. And I have to say it, and the people of Vol. I love the people of Vol. They're very, very, very nice people of Vol. So yeah, Roddenberry was fascinated with this idea of God, and yet he's also a guy who is a self-proclaimed humanist. If you're a humanist, you really believe that everything that we've created is because we are ingenious and creative humans, not because we are instilled by a god with anything special. So here's this humanist who is dying to talk about God. I kind of find that fascinating.
Well, there's probably something in his upbringing that keeps him coming back to God.
I almost wonder if he wanted to be a humanist, but deep down inside, he still believed in God. And so he was at war with himself a little bit over this whole notion.
But we speculate.
But, that's me. I had one psychology class in college, so I'm an expert, and you should listen to me. No, you shouldn't. No.
I had a religious class in college.
I did too. I loved it.
Maybe I'm God. No.
So I'm moving on from there. So the Star Trek development deal of 1975, and that's how we're going to refer to this, was done. It was over. Gene would not receive any more funds to work on a Star Trek project. Barry Diller said, hey, look, you can go ahead and keep your office, and if you want, you can work on other deals from the office. You can even maybe work on other Star Trek treatments. And so it was at this time that Gene asked John Poville to take a stab at creating a Star Trek treatment. And he and Gene started to work on a few things. Strangely, Paramount started inviting other people to pitch Star Trek ideas as well. One of the original producers on the show, John D.F. Black, came in and pitched the story. Robert Silverberg pitched the story. Harlan Ellison, the writer, the guy who wrote on the City on the Edge of Forever, came in and pitched a story. Ray Bradbury.
Really?
Theodore Sturgeon. They came in by invitation from Paramount execs for an interview, and they basically had their brains picked about what would make a good Star Trek story. You see all of this activity by Paramount, and you got to think they're kind of desperate. I don't want to say the word desperate. They're very eager to find something that would work for Star Trek. So that's very interesting as a little nugget to the story as well. Paramount, even though they rejected Gene's treatment, they weren't quite ready to reject Star Trek, just Gene's treatment.
Right. And they're trying to get infused new ideas or something.
Yeah,
maybe.
Right, exactly. Interestingly, too, at this time, the same month that Barry Diller rejects Gene's treatment, that's August, the entire cast of the show reunites for the first time since the show ended at a convention in Chicago. And that convention drew 16,000 people.
Wow.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I think I saw a bit on that on YouTube too.
Cool.
So, oh wow. There was other interesting things going on away from the whole Paramount drama. In September of 75, there was a new show that premiered. It was on ABC called Barbary Coast. And guess who was in it? Doug McClure and Bill Shatner.
God, I remember that as a little kid. Well, a little kid. I was 12, but I was fascinated because Shatner was going to be in it.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember, in my little head going, I'm watching this because my Captain Kirk is in it. I'm watching it.
Right.
And then it's a very different role than Captain Kirk that Shatner played, and he basically plays this master of disguise. Do you remember watching that show?
I vaguely remember watching it. All I remember is same thing you said. I couldn't wait to see my guy Kirk.
Yeah.
In something, and it wasn't Kirk.
No. And unfortunately, the show only lasted a season.
Yeah.
I think it was, it was gone in the spring. But I do remember my excitement leading up to it. Whatever.
Oh, wow. So in the same month, a certain other TV show hit U.S. syndication, Space 1999.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Didn't miss an episode there. There was kind of a Star Trek connection here, kind of, sort of. There were two former actors from another Desilu show, Mission Impossible. They were on Space 1999, Barbara Bain and Martin Landau.
Oh, yeah. I guess I'd forgotten that. When I think of Mission, I think of Peter Graves, but you're right. Landau and Barbara Bain were both in that, too.
Right. So,
Nice.
Interesting. And then in September, Wonder Woman premiered on ABC.
And I just want to point out, do you notice how we worked Wonder Woman in? It has nothing to do with Star Trek, but we just wanted to work it in. What the heck? It was 1975.
Well, right. It kept. Let's hypothesize. It kept the excitement of science fiction and not just the normal storytelling type of thing. I think I've said too much.
No, I think actually you're exactly right. And that's why Space 1999 is important. That's why when we talked about UFO, that was important. Wonder Woman is important for the same reasons. This core audience of sci-fi fantasy viewers, we were getting fed, and that only made us want more.
Exactly.
And what we really wanted was Star Trek, but we had to wait. So, meanwhile, back at Gene's ranch, he is working on a project that he had started before returning to Paramount. This is a wild story. He was writing a script for a group about paranormal events and the coming of extraterrestrials. Yeah. They paid him $25,000 for the first draft. The script was called The Nine. And he got another $25,000 for a rewrite, and the final script, which he turned in December of 1975. But this whole project had some weird stuff going on with it. It was about, he traveled the country a little bit, was observing sort of these, or trying to find supernatural and paranormal events. And he had created a character that sort of witnessed these things. And it just...
Was he doing it for like script ideas, or was it?
Yeah, right. It was all part of this project to write this script, The Nine. But it was a really strange project. It near the end of it, Roddenberry was quoted as saying, "I don't believe in extraterrestrials. I don't even want to do this project." And the guy who hired him to do the project, near the end of this thing, gave him an envelope. And he said, "Don't open this until 1980. And so Susan Sackett, his assistant, is like trying to get him to open it, and he didn't. And they wait. And, in 1980, they opened the envelope. And it basically said, by the time you open this, extraterrestrials will have landed, and many of the chosen will have left with them. What? Yeah. All right. Hey, Gene, you got $50,000 out of the guy. Just be happy about that.
Yeah, just move on and
move on.
Good chuckle later.
Exactly. Good gosh. Prior to him turning in that final script in November, Gene and John Poville really begin working together on a new treatment. And the treatment involved time travel. Oh, that's cool. What Star Trek fan doesn't like time travel? Exactly. Nobody's raising their hand. Exactly.
Exactly.
So author Joe Engel explained that Gene began to introduce some strange story ideas that were inconsistent with what the main story was about. And they didn't coalesce, and they really didn't make sense. And Poville was sort of left with the job of saying, hey, Gene, that really doesn't work, you know? And when he would do that, Gene would begin to tear up.
Really?
He'd get tears in his eyes. And Poville commented later, he said, I found myself tiptoeing around his feelings. Susan Sackett later commented, she said, I would say he was going through a pretty bad depression in those days. For the next several years, the many rejections and setbacks would take their toll on his self-confidence. Nimoy commented about this period. He said Gene was desperate to find an interesting story to tell. He was handed a large canvas. I'm stepping out of the quote, by the Paramount execs.
Yeah, right.
Stepping back in the quote now. And told, here, produce one of your great masterpieces. Nimoy goes on to say, imagine the terror of looking at this empty frame and wondering what to put on it. So, he must have had this terrible lack of confidence going on. If you think about it, what success has he had except Star Trek in terms of producing?
Right. He had successes before that, but
yeah, he was a great scriptwriter. People loved him. People
Right.
loved his writing. But the Lieutenant didn't work. Star Trek, you could say, worked for 3 years, but everything he tried in the 70s after Star Trek never sold. And so I would think that would be tough. It would be very tough. Despite all of this, it seems that Gene was given another deal, though, to produce a Star Trek project in January 1976. And we know this because he wrote the words Star Trek 2 in some notes. And he begins in these notes to have ideas about where his characters are. Where's Kirk at? What's Spock doing? These kinds of things. And the reason we know that this is a new development deal is Star Trek 2 was used not to describe Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan, but the second Star Trek reiteration. So the fact that Star Trek 2 was used, it appears in January 76. There's another deal in the works, and it's the first reference by him of a new deal from Paramount.
Yeah. Now, is this another? Are they referencing a movie, or are they referencing a live TV show?
At this point, we don't know yet. It's just January 76, and the paperwork doesn't really say what's going on yet. But there's something in the works. There's some reason to have some optimism. But what I found very interesting here is that his assistant, Susan Sackett, remembers this period a little darker. She says this project, and I think she's talking about the overall getting Star Trek to the big screen. This project seemed to have a pall of doom over it. And it was a saga that would be played out at times painfully over the next 4 years. Wow. I know. It's hard to imagine that he returns in 75, but we do have to wait 4 years. And it's at the end of the 4 years, it's December before we get to see anything on the screen.
Yeah, wow.
Final thoughts, Cal?
Gene had a tough go of it in the mid-70s.
Yeah, I think he did.
Well, all of the 70s, probably.
Yeah, I think he did. I think it was also the realization that, wow, is Star Trek the only thing I can do right? Well, if that's the case, then, it's my baby and I better do it right.
Yep, pour it on.
Next week, we take a look at the Starfleet Technical Manual by Franz Joseph. It was a book that I loved.
Oh, that'll be fun.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.